About 1 billion people around the world live in shanty towns or slums, eking out an existence in crowded, unhealthy and often unsafe conditions. But why would anyone choose to live like that? Finding an answer to that question led Californian aid worker Scott Sabin on a journey upstream, figuratively and literally. And it led him to some surprising solutions that can be summed up in 3 simple words: healing the land.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hey, welcome back for another week of Signs of the Times Radio. It's great to have you with us. And on the phone from the USA, San Diego, I believe, we have the CEO of an organization called Plant with Purpose. His name is Scott Sabin. How are you, Scott?
Doing well, thanks, Kent.
Excellent. Hey, thanks so much for being part of Signs of the Times Radio this week.
Oh, my pleasure.
You wrote an article online on the Q Ideas website, and also they interviewed you. I read that article, I saw that video, and I thought, this is fantastic. So I did sort of grab those things and put it together for an article. So in a sense, you did write the article. They're your words. They've just been massaged slightly. But no, thanks for that. But you talk about how you got involved in land rehabilitation work. Perhaps we could call you the accidental environmentalist. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's funny. I've actually used that phrase myself. In many ways, it was an accident of geography. I was finishing graduate school here in San Diego and spent a summer in Guatemala learning Spanish in order to graduate. And God used that time to open my eyes to issues of extreme poverty and injustice and people living their faith out in a way that I'd never experienced growing up here.
Yeah.
I still had another semester of school to go, so I came back to San Diego. But I was looking for a place to volunteer where people were exercising that same kind of faith, where people were really serving the poor. That led me to start volunteering at Plant with Purpose. When I started, it was a little bit, I loved the poverty alleviation work. I loved the serving the poor. I didn't quite understand the environmental piece.
Right. So you mentioned in your article it was in Haiti where it sort of started to click. I mean, I know people who've lived in Haiti for a while and done work there, and they've said, this place is amazing. It's just denuded of trees and vegetation. It's just bare rock in so many places. That must have been a bit of a shock to you too, I guess.
Yes, and talking to the people, realizing that 90% of the people make their living as farmers. Yeah. So they depend on that land, that eroded, degraded hillside. That's what they depend on. Oftentimes for a farmer, they have no irrigation, so they're dependent on whatever rain falls, what happens to that rain when it falls, and whatever soil it falls on. And that's really their only assets.
Mm-hmm. So you said you were involved in helping people who were in extreme poverty. I understand a lot of these were ending up in shanty towns, either in town in Haiti or even going over the border into the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, and that's where we started. But as we started to talk to those people, we kept hearing similar stories. They'd come from farming families or they'd been farmers, and they'd shake their heads and say, but there's no future in farming. There's no opportunities in farming. And so we realized if they're coming to these, what looked just desperate slums to us, if they're coming to these places because where they're leaving is worse, where we need to be is upstream. And, we actually think in those terms today, upstream and downstream watersheds, but it started almost kind of figuratively, where is the problem originating from? And we ended up in the mountains talking to to people trying to make their living on the land, and then realizing that it wasn't a unique problem. It wasn't a Haitian problem or a Dominican problem. It really is a global problem throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Any place where you're seeing this massive urbanization, people are leaving the countryside, and a lot of times it's because there's no opportunities there.
Yeah, wow. So when you did go upstream, as you said, and you saw these people on their farmland, what was it about that situation there that was untenable, that wasn't working, that pushed people off the land into slums, as you said?
Well, some of it's perception. Most of the other opportunities, any job besides farming, any educational opportunity, any foreign aid is all coming to the city. And so that draws people like a magnet.
Right.
And some of it's the fact that once the topsoil's eroded away, once the trees are cut, the rain no longer infiltrates the soil, no longer recharges the aquifers, and areas that were once damp, moist, and fertile have become essentially deserts. Then there becomes a point at which farming it no longer works. And so it's a choice of going to the city or going hungry.
Wow. Okay. I find this really fascinating because, in your article, you do quote scripture a few times, and I get the feeling that you're a Christian, with a fairly, close knowledge of the Bible. Even what would you describe yourself as, an evangelical?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, evangelicals, particularly, white evangelicals in the US, are not particularly renowned for their environmental consciousness. I'm not sure if you're aware of that international reputation, but so
I've heard.
So how did the witness of your own eyes in these situations, challenge your spiritual views, your theological views, and how did you make sense of that in the end?
Well, I have to say, like I say, it was sort of an accident, almost a reluctant thing that I got involved in this. And yet it didn't take very long working in Haiti and the Dominican Republic before I realized, the people need the trees. And that put me in close contact with a lot of other people working in the same space. And over time, and I've been doing this for 26 years now, over time I began to realize, yes, that's true, the people need the trees, but that's a pretty utilitarian perspective. And God loves creation for its own sake. And you can see that throughout the Bible, going from Genesis and the creation, where God says, and it was good. And then first puts Adam in the garden to tend it and to keep it. And so that's the very first job ever given to human beings, is to take care of this garden. And realizing that that's a theme that tracks all the way through. I think one of the exciting things about it, as I've learned more, is that God invites us to be involved in his work and his redemptive work in the world. And the New Testament says that, God is redeeming all things through Christ.
And I guess when Christians look at those Bible verses, usually they very much spiritualize it and say, well, we're talking about the redemption of human souls here. We're talking about people, accepting Jesus as the Lord of their life, and basically accepting eternal life in heaven. But you interpret that more broadly in terms of what the physical world, the created world.
I do. And I think that a lot of times what we do physically carries spiritual implications or spiritual lessons. I mean, it's hard to talk about, as we're proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, to do that while at the same time in our lives we're being destructive of what God's already created. I don't know exactly what reconciling creation looks like, but I know that as we proclaim the good news of the kingdom, our actions can be life-giving, or they can be death-dealing and destructive. And I think that you mentioned the reputation of American white evangelicals earlier. That's not a particularly effective witness to God's redeeming work when we have this reputation of not taking care of what God's created.
Yeah, that's a challenge. How do your fellow evangelicals, take to your messages, or take to you, recounting your experiences and what you've learned from them?
Well, I think there's a little bit of an on-ramp. Some people never get past the fact that And there's a story I sometimes tell. When I first started working 26 years ago, my father kind of looked at me, rolled his eyes, and said, "Are you kidding? Planting trees for Jesus? That's about the most marginal thing you can think of to do with your life."
Yeah.
And a lot of people never get past that. But some people do, and they get really excited about the fact that, hey, this makes sense. It's helping people. It's very easy to point to farmers that we work with, and we work currently with about 200,000 people.
Wow.
It's really, really easy to point to changes in their lives. They're eating more. They're getting better nutrition. Their land is thriving. And so it's really easy to make the utilitarian argument. The people need the trees, and that's where we start.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. So when you are talking about restoring the land or rehabilitating the land, I mean, you mentioned, planting trees for Jesus, but I imagine it's a little bit more complex than just planting trees. What else is involved in actually, turning something from an eroded sort of dry area to something that is, fertile and it is growing the sorts of things that are going to, keep families and communities alive?
Well, we do a lot with soil conservation, with rainwater harvesting, with, oftentimes starting with things like bio-intensive vegetable gardens, but things that will give a fairly quick return to the farmers. Traditionally, one of the problems that tree planting programs have had is they take many years to bear fruit, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Right? But you're not going to get the benefits of a tree for 4, 5, 25 years. And so that, again, there needs to be a bit of an on-ramp. So starting with things that are good for the environment, that restore fertility of the soil. Composting is another one, but to have a much quicker benefit. And as people start to move beyond extreme poverty, they're much more willing to invest in the future.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned planting trees, and it's become a bit of a cliche, hasn't it? Really, do-gooders planting trees in order to, and people usually talk about it in terms of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and that sort of thing.
Right.
But I get the sense that there are actually not immediate, as you say, 20, 25 years, but there are actual local benefits from having trees. I mean, you can't eat trees usually, so how do they actually, benefit the soil and the land?
Well, one of the things they do is they allow the rain to infiltrate the soil. If the land is barren, and especially on steep sloping land, what rain does fall runs off very quickly.
Taking soil with it, I imagine.
Taking soil with it, exactly. There's a pretty dramatic reduction in soil erosion when there's tree cover, when the leaves break the raindrops, when leaf litter and biomass allows the rain to soak in. One of the ways that I've learned to think of it is the trees are almost like a sponge that keeps the land moist. But there are trees that fix nitrogen, and so they basically restore fertility to the soil. And then there's all sorts of benefits to the farmer, depending on the type of tree. We plant fruit trees. We plant trees that can actually be used for timber, and that's often counterintuitive. People say, well, how do you, for example, in Haiti, how do you keep people from cutting down the trees they plant? By giving them the right to cut down the trees they plant.
Yeah, sure.
If they have the opportunity to benefit from them, they'll take care of them. Whereas if they see it as some outside kind of invasive program, people are much more likely to not give them a chance to grow.
Yeah, wow. And I guess the more trees and other plants you have on a particular patch of land, the more those roots are sort of holding that soil in place. I mean, is that the sort of basic physical principle at work?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly one of them. There's a lot of different physical principles, and it's both the ending of soil or reduction in soil erosion, but it's also the increase in water resources, and that has been one that in many ways is counterintuitive to me. How can planting trees bring more water? But
well, that's right. Yeah, because trees drink water and plants drink water. So yeah, how could there be? How could rivers or streams return with more plants rather than less? But that happens, does it?
It does. And trees recycle more rain into the atmosphere, and so we've seen rivers and streams return to land that was dry and barren. We've seen rivers that are dry most of the year and maybe flood for a couple days out of the year. We've seen that stream flow moderated so that they flow gently year round.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned how many 100,000 people are you helping around the world?
We're currently working with about 200,000 people.
Man, that's amazing. So 200,000 people. And in which sorts of countries are you working? I'm just sort of trying to get a grasp of the scale of what Plant with Purpose is doing right now.
Yeah, we started in the Dominican Republic and then Haiti and a couple of southern states in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And then we began working in East Africa in 2004 in Tanzania and then Burundi and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia. And then we have one program along the border with Burma in Thailand.
Wow, okay. Man, that's incredible. So, I mean, obviously there must be sort of, the common principles that you've been talking about that would apply in all these situations. But I imagine, due to different climates, different cultures, different soil types, different sort of food and plant types there, you have to have a sort of a local approach as well as, applying the broad principles.
Absolutely. I mean, kind of at a global level, we have three main areas of emphasis: environmental restoration, economic empowerment, and spiritual renewal. And those three things are very synergistic. They're not necessarily separate. But in terms of what people actually plant and how they restore their land, that very much depends on the local environment. And we draw a lot on local farming knowledge. People who've been farming the land all their lives actually know a lot. It's not like a bunch of Westerners coming in with our industrial agriculture technology. It's drawing on skills that are already there and building on skills that are already there.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask about that. The balance between sort of the insights and the methods of the the green revolution versus those local techniques. I imagine there must be scientific insights that you're able to bring to that local context, though.
Yeah, and working with agronomists who are from each of the countries and part of our staff, together we've put together a curriculum that we use everywhere with basic principles.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned one of your three main principles, I think, was spiritual renewal. You just said. So, I mean, how does that work? What does it mean for an individual or a family or a community's self-esteem and spiritual state to be working with their land like this, to be able to stay on the land and to see it restored? I mean, as you say, there are practical, utilitarian benefits, but in terms of like psychologically and spiritually, how does that work?
I'll talk about the economic empowerment first because it feeds directly into that.
Sure.
We use a system called savings groups or village savings and loan associations, in which groups of 25 to 30 people will start to pool their savings. We help them to organize the groups and teach them how to manage the savings. And then they make loans out of those savings. And invest those in farms, in schooling, in other businesses. And we found those groups to be incredibly empowering. And we used to make loans. We used to do microfinance loans.
Yes.
And people would be thankful for that, but there'd be a little bit of a catch, What we hear now isn't thanks. What we hear instead is, look what we did. We didn't know we could do this.
Yeah.
One woman in Dominican Republic told me, the only thing we feel bad about is we've had these resources all along and we never realized it.
Wow. So it's the old, give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish, isn't it?
Right. Well, and once they realize, hey, we can do this, it's a perfect opportunity then to talk about identity in Christ, that we're created in God's image and given talents to use, and again, invited to participate in God's redemptive work in the world. And so what's been exciting is seeing people discover purpose. For a lot of subsistence farmers, they're some of the poorest people in the world. Of the 815 million chronically hungry people in the world, about 80% of them are people who are trying to grow their own food.
Wow.
And in a lot of countries, they are considered to be the ones who weren't smart enough to leave the farm, who aren't contributing anything, who are backwards. And so they've been told, in a lot of cases, they don't have anything to offer for years. And to discover that they have purpose and talents and they're leading the way it's been fascinating. I was in Eastern Congo a couple years ago, and I was talking to a guy who had been a local guerrilla leader. And I didn't realize it. We'd spent a couple days together, and I didn't realize his background. And when I did, I started to ask him more questions. And he told me, the men in this community, we didn't do much. We'd sit around and play cards. And then your pastor came. And I thought, maybe if I help my wife on the farm, together we could do something really great. And then he goes on to talk about disarming the militia, turning in their weapons. And he said, because fighting wasn't getting us anywhere. And so now I'm telling everybody that we should have peace. And I asked him, I said, so did you become a Christian? And he gives me this funny look and he says, no, I've always been a Christian. I just never knew it applied to anything besides Sunday before.
Yeah, wow. Goodness, that is a transformation, isn't it? That's incredible. So, all these principles that you've put in place, or all these lessons that you've learned, through this work, do you get a sense that, do you wish sometimes that other NGOs or even, the governments of developing countries would pick up on some of what you've been developing? Like if you could inject your insights into those sort of wider, broader context, what would you choose?
Well, it would be fantastic. I mean, a lot of it is, there's a lot of NGOs doing really good work.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes, funding tends to be on real short cycles, and that can be a challenge. And I think that's the same challenge that governments will face.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I would love to see more people involved and to see restoration of the land as a key part as well.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who are, working with the same savings groups, but they're not necessarily involving land restoration as a part of that.
Yeah. I guess it strikes me that a lot of developing countries are on this track of, as you've said, let's modernize. We need to move to a modern economy. It's all about health and education and roads and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of that does involve people then moving to population centers away from the land where they traditionally were. I guess I wish, in some ways that some of the insights that you're discovering could, encourage places like that to build up their rural communities, to value the backbone of their economies as it is in some places, or certainly the majority of their population. I'm thinking of our next door neighbour here in Australia, our closest country, which is Papua New Guinea. The majority of the population there are subsistence farmers, and it sometimes seems like their contribution and their way of life is not particularly valued. They're just seen as the bottom of the pile, and they'll get with the modernisation program eventually, hopefully.
Yeah, and then where are all the jobs going to come from? I look at, for example, and I don't know current numbers, but unemployment rates in cities like Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and then, which, last I saw was something like 80%. And, and then one of the outcomes of the earthquake was the infrastructure of Port-au-Prince was way overburdened by the population. And one of the things that people kept talking about is decentralizing, and it's certainly a revitalization of the rural economy would move things in that direction. Yeah, but oftentimes subsistence farmers tend to just be overlooked.
Yeah. Wow, that certainly is really interesting. Now, look, obviously the question is, all right, you're in San Diego, I'm in Australia. Most of our listeners are, going to be in Australia or New Zealand. Obviously, you'd love people to donate to what you're doing, plantwithpurpose.org, check out what Scott and his team are doing and give generously. But are there other practical implications for us, living in Western countries? Or is this just a developing world issue, or are there practical things that we can do in our own context? Well,
and I think it starts small. when we start talking about the global environment,
Yeah.
People use words like save the planet,
Yeah.
and it doesn't take very long before your eyes glaze over and you go, oh my gosh, this is way beyond us.
Yes, yes.
And the answer is yes, it is. I often think our situation is very similar to the situation that if you remember the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 people, and that was just the men, so women and children, maybe 10,000 people or more.
Yeah.
And the disciples come to Jesus with this impossible problem. We've got to feed all these people. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat.
Mm.
And they step out on faith. How are we going to give them something to eat, right?
Yeah.
They step out on faith, and they find this little boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And I always think the absurdity of responding to this problem of 10,000 hungry people with 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Yeah.
And most of our responses to the global environmental problem are going to be in the league of 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Mm.
And yet it was that faith that became the raw material for the miracle.
Mm.
And I think that's where we have to start.
Mm.
I've been blessed to be a part of this, and it is multiplied to a level that I never guessed it would have. It's still a tiny little thing in the face of global environmental issues. But I'm going to continue contributing my 5 loaves and 2 fish. And I think for any of us, whether we're in Sydney or Auckland, there's things that we can do, and probably things you are doing that put you way ahead of us here in the United States, but things that we can do to contribute to be life-giving in the way we live.
Mm-hmm. I guess there are places in the West. I mean, I think of in some US cities there are locations called food deserts. Where basically people are dying of malnutrition, basically, because all they have is fast food. Fruit and veg isn't in their area, and this is often the case in a lot of poor communities. And we also have issues with land degradation and land clearing and all this sort of stuff. I know that these are not just issues in Latin America or Africa or the developing parts of Asia. They are things that are happening right here, and I'm really glad that you're able to actually put these principles into place in the countries where you're working, so the rest of us can learn from them and say, hey, this could possibly even apply in Australia. This could apply in the US or New Zealand or wherever.
One of the things that I learned way back 25 years ago is that oftentimes smallholder farmers are one of the biggest contributors to global deforestation as they clear land to farm or as they make firewood or sell charcoal. And in our case, it's these people that we're working with who are the ones planting the trees. And they've planted over 31 million trees now.
Wow.
I was in Tanzania a couple years ago, and our local director, and this was his initiative, put together an annual competition for the various savings groups to plant trees. Mm-hmm. And every year we have a celebration. And we had 10,000 people come to the celebration this year to celebrate the fact that collectively they'd planted 1.5 million trees this year. And for many of them, they see this as kind of a physical demonstration of their faith and of the fact that they have purpose. And I think they've got a lot to teach us.
Yeah, wow. Well, hey, thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. And I guess the name of your organization, Plant with Purpose, makes a whole lot more sense now. So, yeah, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's been great talking with you.
And if you'd like to know more about Plant with Purpose or even support them with your donation, please check out their website, plantwithpurpose.org.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.